Welcome back, everyone, to another thrilling episode on our channel, where intense stories of relationships and emotions unfold before your eyes. Julia's seemingly perfect life unravels when she discovers her husband Eric's infidelity, triggering a series of shocking revelations. What begins as a personal betrayal spirals into a tangled web of deceit as Julia uncovers Eric's ties to a dangerous affair with a manipulative con artist. The story takes an infuriating turn as Julia is thrust into uncovering systemic corruption, facing relentless threats, and grappling with the devastating fallout of betrayal. Her journey exposes the darker side of trust and loyalty, keeping audiences riveted by the emotional and moral stakes at play. You know, sometimes life feels like a picture-perfect postcard, bright, cheerful, and full of promise. At least, that's what it looked like for Julia. Julia, a 36-year-old financial advisor, lived in a suburban dream, a beautiful two-story house with a white picket fence, a golden retriever named Max, and of course, her husband Eric. At first glance, everything seemed flawless, but as we know, appearances can be deceiving. It's 2020. We're in Cedar Grove, a small but bustling town known for its tight-knit community. Julia and Eric had been together for almost 15 years, married for 10. They met during their college days. Julia was the organized, ambitious type, always one step ahead with her plans. Eric, on the other hand, was the laid-back charmer who could talk his way out of almost anything. Together they made sense. She was the planner. He was the spontaneous one. To everyone around them, they were that couple. You know the kind, always showing up to barbecues with matching outfits, finishing each other's sentences, and giving off the vibe that nothing could touch them. And for a while, that was true. Their marriage had its ups and downs, sure, but whose doesn't? Eric worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave him plenty of flexibility to spend time with Julia. And Max, Julia's demanding career, meant long hours, but they made it work, or at least that's what Julia thought. The cracks in their picture-perfect life didn't show overnight. They came slowly, almost unnoticeable at first, like faint whispers in the background of a bustling room. And that's how we get to the first red flag, Eric's sudden fascination with his phone. Julia first noticed it during dinner one evening. Normally, Eric loved to talk about his day, sharing little stories about the projects he was working on or the funny interactions he had with clients, but lately he'd been glued to his phone, texting, smiling at the screen, then flipping it over as soon as Julia glanced his way. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe he was just excited about a new project or catching up with an old friend. Besides, Julia wasn't the type to snoop or jump to conclusions, but as weeks passed, the behavior continued. Eric became more distant, more distracted. Conversations started to feel one-sided, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then came the gym. Eric had never been a gym guy. In fact, he once joked that the only weights he needed to lift were the groceries Julia brought home. But out of nowhere, he signed up for a membership at a swanky fitness club downtown. Julia was supportive, at least at first. Good for him, she thought. He's taking care of himself. But the gym trips quickly became more frequent. What started as an hour-long session twice a week turned into daily 3-hour marathons. Eric started buying new workout clothes, protein shakes, and expensive cologne, and when Julia playfully asked him what brought on the sudden lifestyle change, his response was, well, vague. Just trying to be healthier, he said with a shrug, avoiding eye contact. Still, Julia gave him the benefit of the doubt. She loved Eric, and love, as they say, is about trust, but trust can only stretch so far before it starts to fray. One night, while Eric was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, Julia wouldn't even glance at it. Privacy was a big deal in their marriage. But this time, curiosity got the better of her. She picked it up, just to check who it was. A message popped up on the screen from someone named T. It was simple, almost innocent. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Julia's heart sank. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who was T? A co-worker? A friend? Her instincts told her this wasn't just a casual message. She quickly put the phone down as she heard the water turn off upstairs. Her hands trembled as she tried to act normal, pretending to scroll through her own phone when Eric walked into the room. "Hey, what's for dinner?" he asked, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside Julia's head. "Just leftovers," she replied, forcing a smile, but the warmth in her voice was gone. That night, Julia barely slept. The message replayed in her mind over and over again. Should she confront Eric? Should she investigate further? Or was she overthinking it? After all, T could just be a friend, right? But deep down, Julia knew better. Her gut had never steered her wrong before, and this time it was practically screaming at her. Over the next few days, Julia started to pay closer attention. She noticed how Eric always took his phone with him, even to the bathroom, how he suddenly started working late at coffee shops instead of his usual home office, how he seemed to be in a constant rush, always coming up with excuses to leave the house. Julia tried to convince herself that she was imagining things. She told herself that Eric loved her, that their marriage was strong, but the evidence was piling up, and denial could only carry her so far. One Friday evening, Julia decided to test the waters. "Hey," she said casually as they sat on the couch, Max snuggled between them. "I was thinking we could plan a weekend getaway, just the two of us. It's been ages since we've done something like that." Eric hesitated. Yeah, that sounds nice," he said, but his tone was unconvincing. "Let me check my schedule and get back to you." That was the moment Julia knew Eric. The man who used to jump at any opportunity to spend time with her now seemed disinterested, distracted, almost as if he had other plans. And that's where we'll pause for now, because trust me, things are about to get a whole lot messier. If Julia thought things were off before, she was about to learn just how far from perfect her picture-perfect life really was. The days following her weekend getaway suggestion were a blur of tension and suspicion. Eric seemed even more distant, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding her. So, like anyone caught in a whirlwind of doubt, she decided to dig deeper. One evening, while Eric was out at the gym, Julia sat in their bedroom staring at his laptop. It was open, but locked with a password she didn't know for years. They'd shared everything: secrets, bank accounts, even Netflix passwords. But now it felt like there was a wall between them, one that Julia couldn't climb over without answers. That's when she remembered something. Eric had once mentioned using the same password for everything she typed in Max's birthday, their dog, not even their anniversary, and just like that, she was in. Her heart raced as she navigated through his emails and messages. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then she stumbled upon a folder titled Projects. Opening it revealed a series of invoices and design files, but buried among them was something she didn't expect: a reservation confirmation for a boutique hotel. The date, that very weekend. Julia's stomach dropped. She clicked on the reservation details, her fingers trembling. The booking was for 2 people, but her name wasn't on it. The guest listed alongside Eric: Tasha Rivers. She didn't know who Tasha was, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The T from the text, the long hours away, the sudden fitness obsession. It all pointed to one thing, and it wasn't good. Julia's mind raced with questions. Who was Tasha? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why? She closed the laptop, her chest tightening as anger, sadness, and disbelief swirled inside her. But Julia wasn't about to confront Eric without more evidence. If he was going to lie, and let's be honest, he probably would, she needed to be ready. The next day, Julia called her best friend. Kara had been her rock through everything, and if anyone could offer advice, it was her. They met at a coffee shop, where Julia laid it all out: the texts, the hotel reservation, the growing distance between her and Eric. Kara, always the pragmatic one, suggested hiring a private investigator. "You need to know the full story before you do anything drastic," she said, sipping her latte. "Besides, if he's cheating, he deserves to be caught." Julia hesitated. Hiring a PI felt so extreme, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. By the end of the week, Julia had hired someone, a woman named Angela, who specialized in uncovering affairs. Angela was discreet, professional, and most importantly, determined. Within days, she had tracked Eric to his gym, where she snapped photos of him meeting Tasha in the parking lot. The photos told a story Julia hadn't wanted to believe. Eric wasn't just working out, he was meeting Tasha for drinks, dinners, and more. Angela even uncovered that they had been sneaking around for months, using work trips and late nights at the gym as cover. And just like that, Julia's suspicions were confirmed. But here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't just hurt, it ignites something inside you, and for Julia that something was a mix of determination and fury. She wasn't about to let Eric off the hook easily. When Eric came home that night, Julia acted normal. She asked about his day, made small talk about the weather, and even laughed at one of his lame jokes. But deep down, she was boiling. She needed time to plan her next move, and she wasn't going to let her emotions get in the way. That's when she decided to set a trap. The following weekend, Julia told Eric she had a work trip out of town. It was the perfect excuse to give him space and to see what he would do with it. As expected, Eric jumped at the opportunity, texting Tasha as soon as Julia left for her trip. But Julia wasn't going anywhere. Instead, she enlisted Angela's help to follow Eric and document everything. And boy, did Eric deliver. Angela captured photos of him picking Tasha up, taking her to the boutique hotel, and spending the weekend like they didn't have a care in the world. The evidence was damning. When Julia returned home, she acted as though nothing had happened, but inside she was seething. She had everything she needed to confront Eric, and she wasn't going to hold back. Before we get into the fallout, and trust me, it's a wild ride, let's take a moment to pause. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps bring you more content like this. Now back to the story. That Monday, Julia confronted Eric with all the evidence. She didn't yell or scream. Instead, she calmly laid the photos and messages on the table. Eric's face turned pale as he realized he had no way out. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" Julia asked, her voice steady. Eric stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but there was nothing he could say that would erase what he'd done. And just like that, their marriage was over. Julia had always prided herself on being composed under pressure, but nothing could have prepared her for the storm that was about to unfold. After Eric failed to come up with an explanation for the incriminating photos and messages, Julia simply walked away. She left him sitting at the dining table, stunned and speechless. It was the calm before the storm, and Julia knew the time for a full confrontation would come soon enough. The days following that initial confrontation were tense. Eric tried to act normal, as though pretending nothing had happened could erase the reality of his betrayal, but Julia wasn't playing along. She avoided him as much as possible, focusing instead on her plan. You see, Julia wasn't just hurt, she was determined to make Eric face the consequences of his actions, and determined to reclaim control of her life. That determination brought her back to Angela, the private investigator who had already uncovered so much. Julia wanted to dig deeper into Eric and Tasha's affair, not because she needed more evidence, but because she wanted to understand the full extent of the lies. Angela didn't disappoint. Within days, she unearthed even more damning details. Turns out, Eric and Tasha had been involved for over a year. They'd met at a networking event, exchanged numbers, and quickly escalated from casual texts to secret rendezvous. Angela even found records of Eric using their joint account to pay for hotel stays, fancy dinners, and expensive gifts for Tasha. When Julia saw the receipts, she was furious. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore, it was about the sheer audacity. That night, Julia decided it was time for the next step. She called Cara and Angela to help her set up what she called the final showdown. Here's how it went down. The following weekend, Julia invited Eric out for dinner at their favorite restaurant. It was the kind of place they used to go for anniversaries, the kind of place that held sentimental value. Eric seemed relieved. Maybe he thought she was ready to forgive him. But Julia had no intention of letting him off the hook. As they sat at their corner table, Eric ordered his usual, a steak with a side of fries. Julia, however, was too focused on what was about to happen to care much about food. Midway through the meal, Julia excused herself to the restroom. Eric barely noticed, too busy scrolling through his phone, probably texting Tasha. When Julia returned, she wasn't alone. Angela and Kara walked in, each holding a folder full of evidence. They marched straight to the table, placing the folders in front of Eric. "What's this?" he asked, his voice shaky. Julia took her seat and leaned in. "This, Eric, is everything. Every lie, every text, every receipt. You thought you could hide this from me, but guess what? The truth always comes out." Eric's face turned beet red as he opened the folders, the photos of him and Tasha at the hotel, the messages he thought he'd deleted. The receipts for gifts he'd claimed were business expenses. It was all there, staring him in the face. "Julia, I can explain," he stammered. "Explain?" Julia snapped. "You don't get to explain. You've been lying to me for over a year. You've been stealing from me, and for what, some fling with a woman who probably doesn't even care about you." The other diners began to notice the commotion. Eric looked around, clearly embarrassed. But Julia didn't care. This wasn't about sparing his feelings. It was about taking back her power. "I trusted you, Eric," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Eric tried to defend himself, mumbling something about how he'd felt neglected, how Julia's career had made him feel like an afterthought, but his excuses only made things worse. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to cheat, to betray me. Do you have any idea what you've done to our marriage, to me?" By now, tears were streaming down Julia's face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of anger, of frustration, of betrayal. Eric didn't have an answer. He just sat there, staring at the evidence, his face a mix of guilt and shame. Julia stood up, her voice steady despite the tears. "We're done, Eric. I'll be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning, and don't think for a second that you're walking away from this unscathed." With that, she walked out of the restaurant, leaving Eric to deal with the whispers and stares of the other diners. Kara and Angela followed close behind, offering her support as they left. Outside, Julia took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. The confrontation had been messy, emotional, and painful, but it was necessary. As they drove home, Kara turned to Julia. "You did the right thing. You know you deserve so much better." Julia nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. "I know. And now, I'm finally ready to move on." When Julia said she was ready to move on, she meant it. But as anyone who's been through a betrayal like this knows, moving on is easier said than done. The days after the confrontation were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and emotional upheaval. Julia wasted no time filing for divorce, but the process wasn't as straightforward as she'd hoped. Eric, true to form, wasn't about to go quietly. At first he tried to play the victim, claiming that Julia's career had pushed him into Tasha's arms. "You were always so busy," he argued during one particularly heated phone call. "I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore." But Julia wasn't buying it. "Oh, please," she shot back. "Don't blame your cheating on me. If you had a problem, you should have talked to me, not run off with someone else." The conversation ended with Eric slamming the phone down, a small but satisfying victory for Julia. And then there was Tasha. As it turned out, she wasn't as invested in Eric as he'd thought. When news of the divorce reached her, she quickly distanced herself, leaving Eric to face the fallout alone. Julia couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction when she heard through Angela that Tasha had blocked Eric's number. But even as Eric's world began to crumble, Julia's challenges were far from over. You see, Eric wasn't just hurt, he was angry. And anger, as we all know, can make people do stupid things. In Eric's case, it meant trying to make the divorce as difficult as possible. He fought tooth and nail over everything, the house, the car, even Max. Julia was devastated at the thought of losing Max, the one constant in her life through all this chaos, but she wasn't about to let Eric win. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, was a godsend. Evelyn had seen it all before, and wasn't about to let Eric's petty tactics derail the case. "Don't worry," she told Julia during one of their strategy meetings. "Men like Eric always try to play dirty, but we've got the upper hand." And she was right. Armed with the evidence Angela had gathered, Julia's case was rock solid. The photos, the messages, the receipts, it was all laid out in black and white. The courtroom drama that followed was intense. Eric's lawyer tried to paint Julia as a cold, career-obsessed woman who had neglected her husband, but Evelyn quickly shut that down, presenting evidence of Eric's infidelity and financial misconduct. The judge, a stern man with little patience for nonsense, wasn't impressed by Eric's excuses. "It's clear to me," he said during the final hearing, "that Mr. Cooper has acted irresponsibly, both as a husband and as a financial partner." The ruling was swift and decisive. Julia was awarded the house, custody of Max, and a significant portion of their joint assets. Eric, on the other hand, was left with little more than his gym membership, and even that seemed uncertain. For Julia, the victory was bittersweet. She had won, yes, but the cost had been high. The marriage she had once cherished was over, and the man she had loved for so long was now little more than a stranger. But life, as Julia soon discovered, has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, Julia received an email from Angela. It wasn't about Eric or Tasha this time, it was about a job offer. Angela, impressed by Julia's strength and determination throughout the case, suggested that she join her private investigation firm. "You've got a knack for uncovering the truth," Angela wrote, "and I think you'd be great at helping others do the same." Julia was taken aback. She had spent her entire career in finance. Could she really pivot to something so different? But the more she thought about it, the more the idea appealed to her. After all, if this experience had taught her anything, it was the importance of seeking the truth. And so, with a mix of excitement and nerves, Julia decided to take the leap. Her first case was a small one. A woman suspected her husband of hiding money in offshore accounts. But as Julia delved into the details, she realized just how much she enjoyed the work. It wasn't just about catching cheaters or exposing secrets, it was about helping people find closure, just as Angela had helped her. As the months passed, Julia began to rebuild her life. She decorated her house, took up yoga, and even started dating again. But more importantly, she learned to prioritize herself for the first time in years. And as for Eric, well, let's just say karma has a funny way of catching up with people. Word on the grapevine was that he had been fired from his freelance gig after a client discovered his less than professional behavior. Tasha, meanwhile, had moved on to someone else, a personal trainer she met at the same gym where she and Eric used to rendezvous. For Julia, the chapter was finally closed. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and adversity, but she had come out stronger on the other side. And that, my friends, is the real takeaway here. Life might throw you curveballs, but it's how you handle them that truly defines you. If you're still with me, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a friend who might need a little inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Julia's decision to join Angela's private investigation firm wasn't just a career move, it was a lifeline. After everything she'd endured, diving into this new chapter gave her purpose and direction. But life wasn't done throwing curveballs her way. The most intense chapter of her journey was still unfolding. One late afternoon, as Julia wrapped up her second solo case, a simple infidelity investigation, she received a call from Angela. The tone in Angela's voice was different, urgent. "Julia, I just got a call from an old client. She needs help, and it's messy. I want you to take it," Angela said. Julia hesitated. "Messy how?" Angela let out a deep breath. "It's Eric." Julia froze. Her grip on the phone tightened as Angela explained Eric had reached out to one of Angela's connections, begging for help. Apparently, he'd gotten himself involved with someone new, someone dangerous. He claimed he was being blackmailed and that his life was falling apart. "Why me?" Julia finally asked. "Because you know him better than anyone," Angela replied. "And honestly, I think you deserve the chance to confront him on your terms." Julia wasn't sure what to think. Part of her wanted to hang up and pretend the call never happened. But another part, the part that had spent sleepless nights questioning every decision she'd made, wanted answers. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet Eric's. The meeting took place at a dingy cafe on the outskirts of town. When Julia walked in, she barely recognized him. Eric looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget with his coffee cup. "Julia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She sat down, keeping her expression neutral. "What do you want, Eric?" Eric launched into a rambling explanation about how he'd met someone new, a woman named Vanessa. At first, everything seemed perfect, but then Vanessa started asking for money, threatening to reveal details about their relationship if he didn't comply. "It's not just the money," Eric admitted, his voice trembling. "She knows things about me, things that could ruin me." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Ruin you, Eric? You've already ruined yourself. Why should I care?" Eric leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "Because she's dangerous, Julia. I think she's done this before, and I don't know who else to turn to." Julia wanted to laugh at the irony. Eric, the man who had betrayed her, was now begging for her help. But as much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't ignore the possibility that Vanessa posed a real threat. Reluctantly, Julia agreed to look into it. But she made one thing clear. "I'm not doing this for you, Eric. I'm doing it because I refuse to let someone like Vanessa prey on anyone else." With that, she left the cafe, her mind already racing with questions. Back at the office, Julia dove into the case. Vanessa's social media accounts painted a picture of a glamorous, jet-setting woman, but something about her online presence felt off. It was too curated, too perfect. Julia suspected that Vanessa had carefully crafted her image to lure in people like Eric. Angela helped her dig deeper, and what they uncovered was chilling. Vanessa wasn't just a manipulative gold digger, she was part of a larger operation. She worked with a network of con artists who targeted wealthy or vulnerable individuals, extorting them for everything they had. The deeper Julia dug, the more dangerous the situation became. Vanessa's group had ties to organized crime, and they weren't afraid to use intimidation, or worse, to get what they wanted. Julia knew she had to tread carefully. She started by tracking Vanessa's movements, following her to high-end restaurants and exclusive events. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. Vanessa wasn't working alone. She always seemed to be accompanied by the same two men, bodyguards perhaps, or partners in crime. One evening, Julia followed Vanessa to a private club posing as a guest. She managed to slip inside and observe from a distance. That's when she overheard Vanessa discussing her next target, a tech entrepreneur with a reputation for being reckless. Julia's blood boiled. Vanessa wasn't just a danger to Eric. She was a predator who thrived on exploiting others. The next day, Julia confronted Eric with what she'd learned. "You're not her first victim," she told him. "And if we don't stop her, you won't be her last." Eric looked genuinely shaken. "What do we do?" he asked. Julia hesitated. Working with Eric wasn't exactly ideal, but if they wanted to take Vanessa down, they'd need to work together. The plan was risky. Julia and Angela would gather enough evidence to expose Vanessa and her operation, while Eric acted as bait to lure her out. It was a dangerous game, but Julia was determined to see it through. Over the next few weeks, Julia and Angela worked tirelessly, uncovering more details about Vanessa's network. They discovered financial records, fake identities, and even a list of past victims. But the most crucial piece of evidence came from Eric himself, a recording of Vanessa threatening him during a heated argument. With everything in place, Julia set the trap. Eric arranged to meet Vanessa at a luxury hotel, pretending to offer her one final payment. Meanwhile, Julia and Angela coordinated with local authorities to ensure they had backup when the time came. The night of the sting, Julia's nerves were on edge. She watched from a nearby surveillance van as Eric entered the hotel, carrying a briefcase filled with marked bills. Vanessa arrived shortly after, her confident stride betraying no hint of suspicion. Inside the hotel room, Eric played his part perfectly. He handed over the briefcase, pretending to plead with Vanessa to leave him alone, but as soon as she opened it, officers burst into the room, catching her and her accomplices off guard. The takedown was swift and decisive. Vanessa and her partners were arrested on charges of extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence Julia and Angela had gathered was enough to ensure they'd face significant prison time. For Julia, the victory was bittersweet. She had succeeded in stopping Vanessa, but the case had forced her to confront the lingering pain of her past with Eric. As she watched him thank the officers, she realized that while she might never forgive him, she no longer felt tied to his betrayal. Back at the office, Angela poured 2 glasses of wine to celebrate. "You did it," she said, raising her glass. Julia smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in what felt like forever. "We did it," she replied. As the weeks passed, Julia continued to build her new life. She took on more challenging cases, grew closer to Angela and her colleagues, and even reconnected with old friends. She was no longer the woman defined by her husband's betrayal. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. And as for Eric, well, let's just say he faded into the background of Julia's life, a reminder of what she had overcome. Julia's story is proof that even in the face of heartbreak and betrayal, there's always a path forward. Sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of another. Vanessa's arrest was supposed to mark the end of Julia's entanglement with Eric's mess, but life, as she was learning, had a way of complicating things further. What began as a victory quickly spiraled into a new storm of challenges, ones Julia never anticipated. A week after the sting, Angela handed Julia a thick manila envelope. "This came in for you," Angela said, her tone unusually serious. Julia frowned as she opened the envelope. Inside were documents, financial records, contracts, and a long list of names. At the top was a simple note written in a rushed hand. "You're not done yet." Julia's heart raced as she skimmed the papers. They revealed connections between Vanessa's operation and a much larger criminal syndicate. This wasn't just about petty cons and blackmail. This was organized crime on a scale Julia had never imagined. "Where did this come from?" Julia asked. Angela shrugged. "No return address, but whoever sent it clearly wants you to dig deeper." Julia wasn't sure if she wanted to. She had already risked so much, her safety, her peace of mind. But as she stared at the list of names, she realized she couldn't walk away, not when so many others could still be in danger. That evening, Julia stayed late at the office, piecing together the puzzle. The names on the list included politicians, business executives, and even law enforcement officials. It was a web of corruption that reached far beyond anything Julia had encountered before. As the hours ticked by, a sense of unease settled over her. If Vanessa's group was just the tip of the iceberg, what else was lurking beneath the surface, and more importantly, who was watching her now? The next day, Julia met with Angela and Evelyn to discuss the findings. Evelyn, always the pragmatist, was cautious. "This is dangerous, Julia. If you go after these people, you'll be painting a target on your back." Angela, however, was more optimistic. "But if we don't, who will someone went to a lot of trouble to get this information to us? Maybe they're counting on us to do the right thing." Julia sighed. "I just want to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Their first step was to dig into the financial records. Julia discovered a pattern: large sums of money being funneled through shell companies, often disguised as charitable donations or business expenses. One name kept popping up: Charles Whitaker, a high-profile real estate mogul with a reputation for being untouchable. Charles wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. He had connections in politics, law enforcement, and the media, making him a formidable adversary. But Julia wasn't deterred. If Charles was involved, he needed to be exposed. Using her newfound skills, Julia began tracking Charles's movements. She discovered that he frequently attended exclusive events, often rubbing elbows with the elite. Angela managed to secure tickets to one such event, a charity gala hosted at a luxurious downtown hotel. The plan was simple. Julia would pose as a donor, mingling with the crowd to gather information. Angela would provide backup, monitoring the event from a distance. The night of the gala, Julia felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Dressed in an elegant black gown, she blended seamlessly with the wealthy guests. As she moved through the room, she kept her eyes on Charles, who was surrounded by a group of admirers. It didn't take long for Julia to strike up a conversation with him. Charles was charming, his smile disarming, but Julia could sense the arrogance beneath his polished exterior. "What brings you to our little event?" Charles asked, his tone warm but calculating. Julia smiled, playing her part. "I've always admired the work your foundation does. It's inspiring." As the conversation continued, Julia subtly steered it toward Charles's business ventures. He spoke enthusiastically about his latest projects, dropping names and details that Julia mentally filed away for later. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman approached them, her expression tense. "Charles, we need to talk," she said, her voice low. Charles's demeanor shifted. He excused himself, leaving Julia alone at the bar. Sensing an opportunity, she followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. Charles and the woman stepped into a private lounge, their voices muffled but urgent. Julia positioned herself near the door, straining to hear their conversation. "You said this was under control," the woman hissed. "It is," Charles replied, "but we need to move faster. If she keeps digging, it could ruin everything." Julia's breath caught. Were they talking about her? Before she could process what she'd heard, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. Julia spun around, her heart racing, only to find Angela standing behind her. "You've been made," Angela whispered. "We need to get out of here." Julia nodded, following Angela out of the hotel. As they stepped into the cool night air, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Back at the office, Julia replayed the events of the evening in her mind. Charles was clearly aware of her investigation, which meant the stakes were higher than ever, but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. With Angela and Evelyn's help, Julia began compiling a report on Charles and his network. They planned to present their findings to a trusted journalist, someone who could expose the corruption without fear of retaliation. But just as they were preparing to go public, disaster struck. Julia's apartment was broken into, files were scattered, her laptop smashed, and a chilling message was spray-painted on the wall. "Stop, or else." Julia was shaken, but not deterred. She moved in with Angela temporarily, knowing it wasn't safe to stay alone. Evelyn urged her to involve the authorities, but Julia was hesitant. Who could she trust, knowing that law enforcement was potentially compromised? Instead, she doubled down on security, installing cameras and encrypting her communications. Every step forward felt like a battle, but Julia refused to give up. The turning point came when Angela received a tip from an anonymous source. The source provided evidence linking Charles to a series of offshore accounts used to launder money. It was the smoking gun they needed. With this new information, Julia and her team finalized their report and handed it over to the journalist. The story broke the next morning, sending shockwaves through the community. Charles denied the allegations, but the evidence was overwhelming. As more victims came forward, his empire began to crumble. Authorities launched an official investigation, leading to multiple arrests within his network. For Julia, the victory was bittersweet. She had uncovered the truth and brought a powerful man to justice, but the experience had taken a toll. She knew she would never be the same. As she sat in Angela's office, sipping a cup of tea, Julia reflected on everything she had been through. From Eric's betrayal to Vanessa's takedown to Charles's downfall, her life had been a whirlwind of chaos and danger. But through it all, Julia had discovered something important: her own strength. She had faced betrayal, fear, and uncertainty, but she had come out the other side stronger and more determined than ever. "Do you regret it?" Angela asked, breaking the silence. Julia smiled faintly. "No, it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I finally feel like I'm in control of my life." And that, my friends, is where we'll leave Julia, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever comes next. Life may not always be perfect, but with resilience and determination, even the darkest moments can lead to something brighter. The fallout from Charles Whittaker's exposure sent ripples across the city, leaving no corner untouched. The media frenzy was relentless, and Julia's role in uncovering the truth brought her a mix of admiration and unwanted attention. But the real storm was still brewing. Julia had learned to trust her instincts, and they told her this wasn't over. Charles may have been the face of the operation, but he wasn't the mastermind. There was someone else pulling the strings, someone more powerful, more elusive. It started with an anonymous message. Julia found it in her inbox one morning, the subject line stark and simple. "You're next." Her heart pounded as she clicked on it. The email contained a single sentence. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." Attached was a photo of Julia outside Angela's office, taken the previous evening. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever had sent the message wasn't just threatening her, they were watching her. She showed the email to Angela, who immediately took it to their trusted tech expert, Marcus. Within hours, Marcus had traced the message back to a burner account, but that was as far as the trail went. Whoever was behind this was careful, leaving no digital breadcrumbs to follow. But Julia wasn't about to back down. She doubled her security, ensuring her every move was monitored and protected. Still, the sense of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. The tension reached a boiling point when Julia received another package, this time delivered directly to Angela's office. Inside was a flash drive containing surveillance footage of Julia, Angela, and Evelyn at the gala. The message was clear. Someone was watching their every move. Angela's face hardened as she reviewed the footage. "Whoever this is, they're trying to scare us into silence." Julia nodded, her jaw set. "Then we make noise." Their next move was to dig deeper into Charles's associates, focusing on those who had remained suspiciously quiet since the story broke. One name stood out: Victor Lang, a reclusive financier with a reputation for operating in the shadows. Victor had connections to nearly every name on the list Julia had uncovered, making him a prime suspect as the true mastermind. Tracking Victor was no easy feat. He rarely appeared in public, conducting most of his business through intermediaries, but Julia and Angela weren't deterred. Using contacts from Angela's network, they managed to find a lead: a private auction Victor was rumored to be attending in a remote location. The auction was a high-stakes affair, accessible only to the ultra-wealthy. Angela pulled a few strings to secure them invitations, but the risk was clear. If Victor or his associates recognized them, they would be in serious danger. The night of the auction, Julia and Angela arrived at the secluded mansion where the event was being held. Dressed to blend in with the elite crowd, they moved through the lavish rooms, keeping a low profile as they searched for Victor. It didn't take long to spot him. Victor was seated at a corner table, flanked by two imposing bodyguards. He exuded an air of calm confidence, his every movement deliberate and controlled. Julia's heart raced as she approached the table. Her plan was simple: strike up a conversation and gauge his reaction, but as she got closer, Victor's eyes locked onto hers, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, Ms. Bennet," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I've been expecting you." Julia froze. She hadn't introduced herself, and yet Victor knew her name. "Please sit," Victor continued, gesturing to the chair across from him. Angela gave Julia a subtle nod, signaling her to proceed. Julia took the seat, her mind racing with questions. "How do you know who I am?" Julia asked, keeping her tone steady. Victor chuckled. "You've made quite the impression. Uncovering Charles's operation, I must say. Your tenacity is admirable." Julia's pulse quickened. Victor wasn't just aware of her investigation, he seemed to respect it, but his calm demeanor only made him more dangerous. "You're not here to flatter me," Julia said. "What do you want?" Victor leaned back, his smirk fading. "What I want is for you to walk away while you still can." Julia met his gaze unflinching. "I'm not stopping until the truth comes out." Victor's expression hardened. "Then you've chosen your path, but be warned, Miss Bennet, paths like yours rarely end well." With that, he stood and walked away, his bodyguards following close behind. Julia and Angela left the auction shortly after, their minds racing. Victor's words were a clear threat, but they only fueled Julia's determination. Back at the office, they began compiling everything they had on Victor, connecting him to a network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and illicit deals. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough to bring him down. As they worked, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was always one step ahead. Every time they uncovered a new lead, it seemed as though he had already anticipated their move. The turning point came when Marcus intercepted a message from one of Victor's associates. The message revealed plans for a major deal involving arms trafficking, set to take place in a week. It was their chance to catch Victor red-handed. Julia, Angela, and Evelyn coordinated with trusted law enforcement contacts, ensuring the operation would be airtight, but the risks were higher than ever. If anything went wrong, they could all be in serious danger. The night of the deal, Julia and Angela joined the task force, watching from a distance as undercover officers moved in on the meeting. Victor arrived in a sleek black car, flanked by his usual entourage. As the deal unfolded, the officers moved in, their presence catching Victor's group off guard. Chaos erupted as Victor's men tried to flee, but the task force was prepared. Within minutes, Victor was in custody, his calm facade finally shattered. For Julia, the sight of Victor being led away in handcuffs was a moment of triumph, but it was also a stark reminder of the risks she had taken to get here. In the days that followed, the full extent of Victor's operation came to light. His arrest led to a series of high-profile takedowns, exposing corruption at the highest levels. For Julia, the victory was bittersweet. She had achieved what she set out to do, but the journey had left her scarred. As she sat in her office, reviewing the final report on Victor's case, Angela walked in with a smile. "You did it, Julia. You took him down." Julia nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "We did it. But now, it's time to move forward." With Victor's empire dismantled and justice served, Julia finally felt a sense of closure. She had faced danger, betrayal, and fear, but she had emerged stronger. And as she prepared for the next chapter of her life, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the woman defined by her past. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a seeker of truth. With Victor Lang behind bars and his empire crumbling, Julia finally felt a sense of relief, but only for a moment. It didn't take long for the remnants of his operation to retaliate. Even without their leader, Victor's associates were desperate to maintain their hold on power, and Julia was their primary target. It began with subtle intimidation. Anonymous notes slipped under Angela's office door, cryptic warnings left on Julia's voicemail, but the threats quickly escalated one evening. As Julia was driving home, her car was forced off the road by a black SUV. She managed to escape unscathed, but the message was clear. They weren't done with her yet. Angela insisted they go into lockdown, relocating their operations to a secure location. Evelyn joined them, bringing her legal expertise to ensure every move they made was airtight. Despite the mounting danger, Julia refused to back down. "We've come this far," she said during a tense strategy meeting. "If we stop now, everything we've done will be for nothing." Angela nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we fight together." The team's next step was to dismantle what remained of Victor's network. Through a combination of surveillance, hacking, and good old-fashioned legwork, they identified key players who were still active. One name stood out: Liam Caldwell, a ruthless enforcer who had been Victor's right-hand man. Liam was known for his brutality, and rumors swirled about his involvement in several high-profile disappearances. If anyone posed a direct threat to Julia and her team, it was him. To bring Liam down, Julia devised a plan that was as bold as it was dangerous. She would bait him into a trap, using herself as the lure. Angela and Evelyn were hesitant at first, but Julia's determination won them over. "This is personal," Julia explained. "He's coming after me anyway. We might as well use that to our advantage." The trap was set at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Julia sent a message through a known intermediary, pretending to offer Liam a deal. Valuable intel in exchange for her safety. The bait was too tempting for Liam to resist. Angela and Evelyn coordinated with local authorities to ensure backup was ready, but Julia knew she couldn't rely on them entirely. If something went wrong, she'd be on her own. The night of the meeting, Julia arrived at the warehouse, her heart pounding. She wore a discreet wire, allowing Angela and the authorities to monitor the situation from a safe distance. The dimly lit space was eerily quiet, the only sound her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Liam arrived shortly after, flanked by two men who looked every bit as dangerous as their boss. He smirked as he approached Julia, his confidence unnerving. You've got guts. I'll give you that, Liam said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But guts won't save you. Julia stood her ground. I'm not here to play games, Liam. You want the intel or not? Liam's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. Let's see it. Julia reached into her bag, pretending to retrieve a file, but before she could finish, one of Liam's men lunged toward her. Julia reacted instinctively, stepping back and pulling out a small stun gun Angela had insisted she carry. The crackling sound of electricity filled the air as the man dropped to the ground. Incapacitated, Liam's other associate reached for a weapon, but before he could act, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse as the authorities stormed in. Chaos erupted. Liam tried to flee, but Julia wasn't about to let him get away. She chased him through the maze of crates and machinery, her adrenaline surging. When she finally cornered him, he sneered. You think this changes anything? Liam spat. You've got no idea what you're up against. Julia didn't flinch. Maybe not, but I know how to fight. The authorities arrived moments later, taking Liam into custody. As he was led away, Julia couldn't shake his parting words. What had he meant by no idea? Was there more to Victor's operation than they'd uncovered? Back at their secure location, Julia, Angela and Evelyn pored over the information they'd gathered. Liam's arrest had provided new leads, including a hidden ledger detailing payments to powerful individuals. The names on the list were shocking: judges, CEOs, even a senator. This isn't just a crime ring, Evelyn said, her voice grim. This is systemic corruption. The realization was both daunting and motivating Julia, and her team knew they had to act fast. With every name they exposed, they risked retaliation from those who had the most to lose, but they also gained allies. Whistleblowers began to come forward, inspired by Julia's determination. These individuals provided crucial evidence, strengthening their case and bolstering their resolve. The climax came when Julia and her team decided to go public. They partnered with a national news outlet to release a comprehensive exposé detailing everything from Victor's initial operation to the corruption at the highest levels. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Arrests were made, resignations filed, and public outrage reached a fever pitch. For Julia, it was a moment of vindication, proof that their efforts had not been in vain. But the victory was bittersweet. Julia knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be new threats, new challenges, but for the first time, she felt prepared to face them. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Julia took a deep breath. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been defined by betrayal. Now, she was defined by her resilience, her courage, and her unwavering pursuit of justice. Angela joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You ready for what's next? She asked with a grin. Julia smiled, her confidence unshakable. I am. Let's get to work. And with that, Julia stepped into her new role, not just as a private investigator, but as a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. Her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. As the dust settled after the explosive exposé, Julia finally found herself standing at the crossroads of resolution and reflection. Victor Lang's arrest and the subsequent takedown of his vast network had created waves that rippled far beyond her own life. The city was shaken, reforms were being called for, and justice was finally catching up to those who thought they were untouchable. But for Julia, the victory came with a heavy dose of reality. She had spent so much of her time chasing the truth, diving headfirst into the chaos, that she hadn't stopped to consider what came next. Angela noticed the shift first. You've been quiet lately, she said one evening as they sat in the office, the hum of the city faint in the background. Julia smiled faintly. Just thinking about everything, about how far we've come, and how much I've changed. Angela leaned back in her chair, watching Julia with a knowing expression. You've come out of this stronger, that's for sure. But what are you going to do with that strength now? The question lingered in Julia's mind as she packed up her things and headed home that night. In the weeks following the climax of the case, Julia started to rebuild her life, not as a victim of betrayal or as a relentless seeker of justice, but as someone ready to embrace the future, her journey had taught her that life wasn't about the perfect picture or the pristine plan. It was about resilience, adaptability, and finding strength in unexpected places. Max, her ever-faithful golden retriever, was her constant companion through it all. Evening walks with him became moments of peace, a chance to breathe and reflect on the whirlwind she had lived through. One afternoon, while walking Max through the park, Julia ran into an old friend, Cara, her confidant from the early days of her divorce. Cara was thrilled to see her and wasted no time catching up. "You look lighter," Cara remarked, her tone warm. "Like you've finally let go of all that weight you were carrying." Julia laughed. "I think I have. It's amazing what a little closure can do." Cara's words stayed with Julia. She realized she wasn't just lighter, she was free from the pain of Eric's betrayal, free from the fear that had haunted her throughout the investigation, and free to embrace a life that was entirely her own. Angela, ever the mentor and friend, had one last surprise for Julia. During a small celebratory dinner at their office, Angela handed Julia an envelope. "What's this?" Julia asked, raising an eyebrow. "Open it," Angela said with a grin. Inside was a partnership agreement. Angela was offering Julia a permanent role as her equal, a testament to the incredible work they had done together. Julia's eyes filled with tears. "You mean this? You're serious?" Angela nodded. "You've earned it, Julia. You're not just part of this team, you're the heart of it." Signing the agreement felt like closing a chapter and opening a new one all at once. Julia wasn't just moving forward, she was stepping into her power. As for Eric, he faded into the background of Julia's life, just as she had hoped. After losing everything in the divorce and being publicly tied to Victor Lang's network, Eric left the city, seeking a fresh start elsewhere. Julia didn't waste time thinking about him. Her life had grown too full to leave room for regrets. The story of Julia's fight for justice didn't just end with Victor's takedown, it became the foundation of something bigger. The cases she and Angela took on after that were deeply personal, helping people who had been silenced, deceived, or left powerless find their voice again. Each case was a reminder of why Julia had started this journey in the first place. Her work gained attention, not just from local clients, but from national organizations. Offers poured in, inviting Julia to speak at conferences, write a book, and even consult on high-profile cases. But Julia kept her focus where it mattered most, on the people who needed her help the most. In her downtime, Julia finally allowed herself to explore life outside of work. She reconnected with old hobbies, joined a hiking group, and even started painting, a skill she hadn't touched since college. It was messy, imperfect, but beautifully hers. And then there was a new relationship. It started quietly, unexpectedly, with someone who saw Julia for who she was, not just the woman who had been through hell and back, but someone strong, vibrant, and whole. Their first date was simple, a coffee shop conversation that stretched into hours. He listened, laughed, and shared his own stories of resilience. Julia didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to find out. The final scene of Julia's story isn't dramatic or flashy. It's quiet, powerful, and full of promise. It's Julia walking through the park with Max by her side, a smile on her face, and a sense of peace in her heart. Her story isn't about perfection or fairy tale endings. It's about growth, strength, and the knowledge that life, no matter how messy, can always lead to something beautiful. And as Julia walks forward, we're reminded that her journey isn't over, it's just beginning. If you've been inspired by Julia's story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe to my channel for more stories of resilience, justice, and triumph. Your support helps us bring these tales to life, and we can't wait to share what's next with you. Until then, thank you for watching, and remember, no matter how dark things may seem, there's always light waiting at the end of the tunnel.